Hey guys, Caro here with your art lesson number 4. Before we go in, I have a quick message from JC who wants to see you all, and we're going to get a quick stretch on, right? So we're going to do a chair stretch. We're going to stretch to our left, stretch to our right, stretch up, and down. We're going to give ourselves a big hug and a squeeze, and take a deep breath in, and relax. Alright guys, enjoy.
Love you guys. Hope you're paying attention. Hope you're doing everything that Gato's saying. Make sure you color something beautiful. Alright guys, see you soon.
Lesson 4, Ceramics, Basics, Process and Terminology. The objectives for this lesson are to learn about the ceramics process, understand basic ceramics vocabulary, identify ceramics tools, and create a vision for your next ceramics project. So what is ceramics? Ceramics is the art or technology of making objects of clay and similar materials treated by firing. They are articles of earthenware, porcelain, and or brick. So if you guys remember back in the art class, we have 2 kilns in the back that we use to fire our clay. The ceramics process and origins. So ceramics generally starts with a clay-based material dug from the ground and is mixed with water. So the water makes it soft and flexible so you can shape it into whatever you're trying to make. Then it's fired at a high temperature in a large industrial oven, and those are called our kilns. Like I said in the previous slide, we do have 2 kilns at the WOW Center that we use when we're making our ceramic flowers, our vases, and things like that. So firing is what most ceramics have in common, and there's 4 basic processes that take place when you're working with clay. So first you're going to dig the raw material from the ground, then you're going to add the water, we're going to shape it, and firing. So when we receive the clay, the first 2 processes have already taken place. They've already been dug from the ground and the water has been added to it. So we start off our process and shaping it into whatever we're trying to make, and then going on to firing it to set the clay and harden it. So what does it mean? We're going to take a minute to listen to the different words and terms that we're going to be discussing and hearing about in the following videos about the ceramics process. So first we're going to talk about clay, which is the material that we use to make our ceramic pieces. We're going to talk about molding and sculpting, which is the process that we use to mold or shape whatever we're trying to make. Sometimes in our class we use cookie cutters to make our ceramic flower bouquet. Sometimes we use molds to make more complex things like a vase or a mug. Firing, which is the process where you heat the ceramic clay at a high temperature so that it can reach the point where it can no longer melt and it hardens the clay. The kiln, which is the industrial oven that we use to get to those high temperatures. And finally the glaze, which is the paint or the color that we give our finished product to give it a nice shine, a nice color, to make it aesthetically pleasing. In the next few slides, we're going to explore each step of the ceramics process. Okay, the first video we're going to tune into is going to show us how to pour molds for your ceramic process, and their second video is going to be how to mold by hand. So you can do either one. It depends on really on what you're making. Like I said in the previous slide, if you're making something more complex like a cup, a vase that needs like a definite shape, then you would definitely go for your molds. And if you want to make something more unique like a pinch pot or a ceramic flower bouquet, then you'd use your hand molding.
Okay, I'm going to pour the 1-piece mold. It's a good idea to get a pitcher and fill it up with enough slip that you know it's going to fill up your mold here. So I'm just going to go through the process of casting a cup, and it's the process that I use. It works for me. It varies from person to person, and it also works with the type of casting slip I'm using. But what you want to do is have your dry mold, and you may want to get some kind of a pitcher or something like that and fill it up at a pretty steady rate. Avoid stopping in between because the plaster immediately starts absorbing the water, so if you take a break, you're going to get a line that's going to have to be cleaned up later. And so you fill it up, go ahead and fill it up over the top and let it spill over. And then for this slip in my interests, I cast this for about 10 minutes, and that's going to get me like about 1/8 of an inch wall. So what's happening here is that this dry porous plaster is drinking out the water from your casting slip, and while it's doing that, it's building up a wall on the inside, and you can kind of see how the fluid level has dropped as it's pulled the moisture out. When you can actually see the wall there. So the way I do it and the way I'd recommend doing it if you want a nice, level, even cup is after a few minutes and you notice the level's gone down as you need to top it off. And for something like this, probably, since it's not casting for that long, probably only once over the course of the whole casting timed period. All right, so the time has passed, and it's time to now pour the excess casting slip out. So I'm just using my bucket that I mixed all my slip in to start. And there's a particular way that to pour this out that's going to give you a nice interior. And I picked this thing up at the hardware store. This is actually like a closet shelving thing, and I like to use these to pour my slip out on. It goes through it and it holds your mold up here. But you could easily also use a piece of wood here. And saying that, why we have this little elevated rod here is that we want to pour this thing out and let it rest at an angle like this. And you leave it in here until it just completely stops dripping. And why I do this and leave it at an angle is that if you actually turn it completely upside down, and this is particular to a cup, that the flat bottom of the interior is going to have little drips of casting slip as it sets up. And whenever you look in your cup and you're drinking from it later, you're going to have some undulations and irregularities from drips of casting slip on the bottom. All the slip's poured out, it's stopped dripping, interior of our cup form is dry, so I'm going to go ahead and just cut this excess material off the top of my razor knife. And I'll slice it all the way around and use the top of the plaster as a guide, but I don't go completely perpendicular to the shape of my form. I always kind of hold my knife at a little bit of an angle, so I'm kind of slicing like this. I'm just going to cut down in here, go all the way around. Okay, it's just going to be a few more minutes and this thing will be ready to be removed from the mold. So I think our cup's probably ready to be turned over and to get this thing out of the mold. And I know that because as the water's being drawn out, just like with a normal soft clay, as it dries, it's shrinking, and I can see that there's a little gap here that's around the edge, so it seems like it's come loose in there. So the way I do this, I like to take a board or something flat and just put it on the top, and I'm going to turn this thing over in the manner that you'd flip over a cake, I guess. And because our clay piece on the inside is shrank, it should just drop right out. Okay. At this stage, you want to be very careful when you're picking it up not to deform the rim. Just like throwing porcelain, clay has memory, and anytime you deform these things, even if you deform it and try to put it back into shape in the firing, it's gonna change its shape again back to its deformed, however you've deformed it. Now I previously already cast a cup, and I want to go over the method that I use, that it works pretty well for as far as treating the rim if you've accidentally cut it irregular, it has some wavers on it, or if you want to make it rounder. I do this kind of cleaning up the rim whenever the cup is actually bone dry, and that helps keep me from squeezing it and deforming it. So what I'm going to use is some vinegar and water and my rasp and sponge. I'm just going to dip the rim of this thing in the vinegar. Just let it soak in for a second. And now if I look at my rim and if it has any irregularities, I can plane it down here. And then I'm going to go ahead and kind of create a nice little bevel here so I don't have this sharp edge. And I'm just going to go around it. Kind of soften it up. Lastly, inspect it and then smooth it out with the sponge. I also want to look around the whole thing and just see if there's any irregular parts, see if my slip created any weird lines or anything like that. And you can get like that. You can go ahead and smooth the whole cup down. Okay, there it's done.
So on the previous slide, you guys were able to watch a little clip about someone doing some slip casting. So that's when you use a very watered down form of clay when you pour it into a mold and then you create your piece. He was working on a cup. And this video now that we're going to watch is going to be a video about making a pinch pot, which is using your hands and molding manually instead of using a cast.
Hey, today we are going to be making a pinch pot. First thing we're going to need to do is get our lump of clay into a sphere. So to do that, I'm going to take the clay and tap it on all 6 sides until it becomes a cube. Then I'm going to take, or something more like a cube, then I'm going to take the palm of my hand and dent down the corners and edges. Creating more of a sphere. Then, using the palm of my hand, I'm going to cup and hold the clay, encouraging it to become a sphere. Notice that my fingers are not digging into the clay, but I'm just creating a nice round form. Next, I'm going to look for any blemishes or yucky spots, folds or crevices on the ball. If they're there, that's the place that you're going to want to put your hole. But I don't have any, so I'm good. So I'm going to take my thumb, keeping it nice and straight, and I'm going to press down into the ball. And I can sort of check how deep I am and then compare it to make sure I've got just about enough space at the bottom. I do. Then I'm going to spin the ball around my thumb, pressing my thumb down and out. Finally, I'm going to take my thumb and I'm going to crook it into the palm of, or the fingers of my hand so that I'm widening the base of the pot. Notice that I'm supporting the clay at all times and I'm encouraging the form that I want it to take by making that form with my supporting hand. To pinch the clay, you want to make sure that you are using what I call a kind pinch, that the meaty parts of your fingers are coming together. You don't want to use a hurtful pinch like this because that'll mar your clay. So you want to go all the way to the base of the pot and pinch. Now I'm going to try and keep my top finger perfectly horizontal, and I'm actually growing the pot more vertical this way. If you've ever had a problem with a pot wanting to open up and become more of a bowl, it's usually because you're working at it from above, and that's kind of hard to do. You're going to overlap your pinches so that you get a nice even thickness, and this is at the base of the pot. Then you're going to work more towards the rim, but without actually touching the rim. You're going to overlap your pinches, and this is going to continue to grow your pot a little more vertical, even though it looks horizontal right now. As soon as we flip it up, it'll be vertical. Now, you're not a machine, but you're going to try and make sure that all your walls are about the same thickness and that you don't have any large divots. You should have small little impressions. Don't worry if your clay gets a little cracky. We've done a whole lot to the clay in a short period of time. We've taken it from a solid cube to an open vessel in a short period of time. The last thing that I'm going to do is not really pinching the rim, but I'm just going to make sure that the rim's as even thickness as it can be. When you look down on it from above, the wall should be about all the same thickness. This is called collaring the pot. That's wrapping your fingers around the outside edge and then using a swiping motion, you're going to sort of heal in any of these crevices that have happened because we've just sort of stretched the clay out a lot. You can also use this swiping motion on the walls of the pot if it's cracky. I always say that you want to touch it like a gentle massaging kind of stroke. Nothing very hurtful or painful. You just want to make sure that you're sort of encouraging the clay to be smooth again by sliding your fingers over it. You do the same thing with the wall of the pot. Always make sure you put your fingers inside, and here I'm sliding my thumb along the outside edge, outside surface. There's a crack right there. I'm going to swipe it over and get it nice and smooth. If you start with cubes that are about, or portions of clay that are about the same volume, then you're going to end up with pots that are about the same volume. Now earlier I said you're not a machine, so all your walls aren't going to be perfectly the same thickness, but you're going to be close. Probably the thing that upsets students the most is that the rim is irregular. So you're going to have some high spots and some low spots. That's okay. That's to be expected. Don't worry too much about it. Remember that you also want to put your name on the bottom of your pot. If you need it to stand up like this and become a vessel, you can gently take the pot and tap it onto the table surface. If you need it to become something like a turtle shell or the base of a monster that's going to go that way, then make sure you leave that area nice and domed, and you can do that by taking your thumb and pressing up into the dome, making it nice and neat. And that is how you construct a pinch pot.
So there's just a few things that you have to note before you start working with clay or determine what process of the ceramics making you're in. So before you fire anything, you have to make sure that the greenware, which is what the clay is called before you fire it, is in the right state or phase before firing it. So before you fire anything, you have to make sure that it's completely dry, which is referred to as bone dry in ceramics. If you put something in the kiln that is not completely dry, chances are it's either going to crack in the kiln or explode. The reason for that is that there's still water inside of the clay. So when you put it in the kiln, it expands and it makes it crack. So you have to make sure that you have the right consistency before firing it. So again, before you fire any clay, the clay is called greenware. Once you fire it, it turns into bisqueware. Another thing to keep in mind is that greenware can always be reshaped. So even if something is in the process of drying or almost completely dry, you can always re-wet it or add clay so that you're able to mold it again. Once you do fire the clay, however, you can't go back and fix it. By that time, it's already hardened to the point where you can no longer fix it. But as long as it's in the process of still being greenware, of any of the phases, you can always add clay or water to remold it the way that you want. Okay, so now we're going to go into the second step in our process. We already went through our molding, our sculpting. So the next step after it dries and it's completely bone dry, we're going to go into our firing process. That's when we put the greenware into the kiln to make it bisqueware. So we're going to click on the video up there and we're going to learn a little bit more about the firing process.
All right, so we are here with the kiln. The kiln is our most important tool for when we are doing clay because it's what takes it from being a very fragile piece of clay to something that is hard like stone. So inside the machine, there are what we call the heating elements. So they're just coils of little metal, and that's what heats up and heats up the inside of the kiln. You can see down at the bottom we have shelves and posts, so that way we can stack shelves all the way up to the top. Over here on the side, this is the control center. This is the brains of the operation. All right, so when you finish with your clay, it's going to be a dark gray color like this. One way to know whether it's ready to fire or not is that its color is going to change. But as its color changes and gets to be a lighter gray, the clay gets hard, but it's very easy to break. And so if you're not careful when you pick it up, it might just snap or fall apart. And so that's why it has to go to the kiln to get hard and hard like a stone or like a brick. All right, so the next step when you are done with clay is that it has to sit over here on the shelves to dry. And so it usually takes it about a week to thoroughly dry out so all the water is gone. If the water is not completely gone, when it starts to heat up in the kiln, the water turns into steam and causes the clay to kind of explode. And so it shatters into a bunch of pieces. So it's very important that it sits to dry. Usually everything is spread out so it's not touching any of the other clay while it dries, but I've gone ahead and done some cleaning to the clay to make it ready for the to fire. So to clean our clay, a lot of times I'll take one of my knives and I'll scrape the edges, or I might take this Brillo light pad and kind of sand down the edges, because we want it to look nice before it gets fired, because once it's fired, it's that way forever. All right, so now it's time to load all of this into there.
When you are firing clay for the first time, it can be stacked up and can touch each other. It doesn't have to have a lot of wiggle room. There just needs to be a little bit of room around the edges of the shelf so the air can circulate around the clay tiles.
And so we can really fire a lot of pieces all at the same time when we squish them close together. See inside, we've run out of room on this shelf to stack it any higher. So that's where these little pegs, the stilts, come in handy, because then they can hold up another shelf above the other one, and we can just keep stacking everything in until we have all our clay loaded. Now, as I'm loading this, you can also see this little guy down here. He's like a thermometer for the kiln. He measures the temperature and how hot it gets inside. So this tells the kiln when to stop heating up or if it needs to heat up longer. So he's a pretty important guy, so I want to leave lots of room around him. And so it's very important that when you're making stuff, you attach it the right way. Otherwise, it falls off, like in this guy's case. And so that's why when I'm doing this, I have to be very careful and very focused to try not to hurt anybody's clay project. As you can see, I'm pretty close to the top, so I don't think I'll have room for another shelf. But I think I have room for all my pieces that are ready to fire. All right, so the next step is to close the lid and secure it. And then over here on the control box, I need to tell it exactly what I need it to do. So I'm going to say it needs to fire, and it needs to be at a certain temperature. And I want it to go fast, so that way we can be ready to work on it the next day. And now it's ready to go. All I have to do is press start. So we're back, and it's time to open the kiln to see how everything turned out. Usually I fire after school, and then it takes that whole night to heat up to the temperature it's supposed to get to, which is close to 2,000 degrees. And then it has to slowly cool back down, which usually takes until right first thing in the morning when school starts. So let's open her up and see how everything turned out. And so it looks like we had a great fire. It doesn't look like anything got broken, and everything is just like it's supposed to be. And so now I have to take everything back out of the kiln and put it back in all the teachers' tubs, so that way you can find your clay and work on step 2, the glaze process.
Okay guys, so a couple of things to know about the firing process. Remember, the kiln gets extremely hot, so it's not safe for us to go in the kiln room at any time without being supervised. The only time that you guys are able to come to the kiln with me is when we're loading it. That means the kiln hasn't been set yet and it's not hot. And when we load it, we put in our pieces depending on what we're loading. If it's greenware, that means it doesn't have any glaze on it, then you can put it directly on to the kiln. If we're working with something that has been glazed already or it has paint, we can't put it directly on there because it'll melt directly onto the kiln. So we have to load it up onto stilts. So just remember, whenever we're firing, it has to be 1, completely dry, and 2, that you're not able to change it afterwards and it's exactly the way that you want it. After you fire, it does turn from greenware into bisqueware. So that's going to be the second phase of our ceramic process. So now we're going to go into our third and final step of the ceramics process, the glazing process. So this is probably my favorite part for a lot of reasons. My favorite thing about glazing is that it gives your piece something unique, something that you created in your mind and you're able to transfer on to your piece. So enjoy this video and then we'll get back with some important things to know about glazing.
It's always exciting when you get to glaze your pots finally, and you get to take them from being pink and looking like everyone else's to something that's really, really beautiful and unique. So today we're going to talk about glazing and just the very basics of how we're going to do it. The first thing you want to think about is it actually bisqueware, and that's a new term for us. Bisqueware means it's been fired in the electric kilns once, which means it is no longer greenware. So first, let's discuss the difference between greenware and bisqueware. One of the first things you'll notice is the color difference. Greenware, even when it's really, really dry, bone dry, it's actually more gray than pink. Another thing you'll notice is the sound that it makes when you hit your fingernail or a metal tool on it. So when you hit this one, there's a clunk, 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 almost a hollow sound like when you're hitting a pumpkin or a melon. And when you hit the bisqueware, there's a very bright sound, more like a wind chime or a bell. So that's one thing you can look for. If you want to get really weird, you can actually lick your pot. And if you lick the bisqueware pot, your tongue will stick to it and it will not stick to the greenware pot. But I don't recommend licking your friends' pots because you don't know where their germs have been. So we look at the color, we look at the sound, and then worst case scenario, if you're really confused, you can always ask me and I will tell you if it's ready to glaze or not. So now that we've decided it's actually bisqueware, I want to tell you about the importance of not putting glaze on the bottom of your pot. If you notice this already glazed bowl, it has a ring on the bottom, like the foot ring on this bowl, that has no glaze on it. And the reason that is, that's called a dry foot, and that's also a new vocab term. The reason you want to have a dry foot on the bottom of your pot is because glaze doesn't know the difference between the pot that you're glazing and the kiln shelf. So if you put glaze on the bottom of your pot and then stick it on a kiln shelf, what ends up happening is after it melts, you get a bowl attached to a kiln shelf, and that's not really useful unless you're super strong and want to lift a kiln shelf every time you're slurping your cereal milk. So you need to make sure there's no glaze on the bottom. Potters used to just glaze their pots and then wipe the bottom off with a sponge. But we have a trick that we use that makes it a lot easier. And what we use is wax. Let me see if it's even labeled. There it is. And so what we're going to do is we're going to think about all the spots that are touching the kiln shelf, plus a little bit up the wall on each side. And as I'm waxing this, I'll tell you why that's important. So first I'm covering the bottom of each pot with wax. And then you'll notice that this foot ring is about 1/4 of an inch up on either side. And what we're gonna do is we're gonna put wax all the way up till it reaches the bottom of the bowl. And the reason we wanna do that is because each glaze is a little bit different. But we've talked about the fact that glaze has silica in it. And silica is a glass former. And when there's a lot of silica in a glaze, or a lot of flux, which is what makes the glaze melt, the glaze actually relaxes in the kiln, and I like to think of it as kind of shrugging down, and it could potentially touch the kiln shelf. So we need a little bit of wiggle room in case the glaze decides to run down the foot of our pot a little bit. All right, So now we've done the outside, and that's usually the side people remember to do. A lot of times what people forget is that the inside of their foot ring needs to be waxed also. Otherwise it's going to stick on the inside. In one of the next glazing videos, I'll show you how to use a banding wheel, which makes this process a lot faster and a little bit less cumbersome. So when we glaze this, we'll be glazing this part of our pot, the very bottom, and the inside. So next we need to talk about glazes. When you're deciding what color of glaze you want to use, you're going to notice a lot of test tiles that are either cups like this with ridges in the middle, or flat tiles that are L-shaped. They also have ridges in the middle. Either way, it's going to tell you what the glaze is going to look like after it's been fired. So the reason this is important is if you look in the glaze buckets, you're going to see colors like this. And this glaze is Tinmaku, or Hamada Rust is another name of it, and it actually turns out this color. You'll notice this side of the tile, where the ridges are, where it goes over the sharp edges, it turns brown. So this would be a really good glaze to use if you had a lot of details on your pot, because you'd be able to see the details better when it goes over the surface. You can also see on the flip side that when you put it on thicker, it turns black. So be cautious if you really like this kind of rusty black and gold color that you put it on just with one coat versus two. The backs of these tiles have 2 dips on them. Now that you've picked what color you're going to do, you're almost to the part where you actually get to glaze your pot, but there's one more thing you have to check before you actually glaze it, and that's to make sure that the glaze is the right consistency. So if you look at the top of this glaze bucket, what you might notice is that there's kind of a liquidy, watery section on top that isn't the same as the rest of the glaze, and as I stir it up, the clear section of water goes away as I mix it. I'm also kind of feeling around on the bottom to make sure that there are no big chunks or that one particular chemical has settled on the bottom. Sometimes people think that if the top of the glaze is stirred up that that's good enough, but really it's not, because some of the important chemicals might be at the bottom, and if you don't get the right combination, the glaze won't turn out the way you want it to. So now that I've made sure that there's no chunks and it's all the same consistency, I want to think about what consistency that is. And ideally you want it to be a little bit thicker than whole milk. You want it to be not super chunky like oatmeal. You want it to be runny enough that it goes onto your pot evenly, but you don't want it to be so thin that you don't get enough glaze on there. So if it's like, you know, thick, well-stirred hot chocolate, that's what I like to think about it as being. All right. When you're glazing with any of the glazes that are red colored while they're in liquid form, you want to be careful about getting them on your clothes, because it means that they have iron oxide in them, which I said before is the same as rust. So you want to make sure that if you need to wear an apron, you wear one, or bring an extra change of clothes from home so that your parents aren't mad at you for getting glaze on your clothes, or just be super careful when you're using these glazes that have a lot of iron in them. So what I'm going to do to glaze this bowl all one color is I'm going to use this pair of tongs, and I'm going to clamp the side, and I'm going to make sure that it's firmly clamped before I let go. Now when I put it in the glaze, I'm going to make sure it gets all the way in, and I'm going to hold it under only for about a full second before I pull it out and make sure all the glaze is dumped out. So you can see what that looks like. So I'm going to go in 1001. And then I'd make sure all the glaze is dumped out. Make sure you also dump out the glaze that's caught in the foot ring. Some people forget about that and they end up splashing that on their clothes. You see that the glaze is drying fairly quickly, and that wax has done a really good job of keeping the glaze off the bottom. Next, I'm going to flip it over and unclamp the pot, and you'll see that there are these little marks from where the tools were. So what you can do is you can put a tiny bit of little glaze on the inside. If you have any cuts on your fingers, any wounds from other classes, if you take Mr. Duvall's class, you'll know what I'm talking about. You'll want to make sure that you either use gloves or a paintbrush because you don't want to get the metals inside of your cut because it's not very good for you. Since I do not have any cuts on my finger, I am confident I can smooth it all out. All right. If you see any of these smaller bumps on the surface, those will actually melt out once it's really hot, so you don't have to worry about getting it perfectly smooth. You just want to make sure that it's smooth in general. You can see that there's some bumps on the inside, and what you can do is just take your finger and lightly sand them to make it smooth. And now we can go over to the sink and get it ready for the kiln. To get your pot ready for the kiln, you have to make sure that you have a truly dry foot, which means there's no glaze on the bottom. So even though the wax did an excellent job of keeping most of the glaze off, you can see that there's still a few spots on there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a sponge and make sure that I wring most of the water out of it. And then I'm going to just give it a quick little wipe to make sure that there's no glaze spots. Double check that I've gotten glaze all over everywhere on my piece of pottery. And now I can take it out to the kiln and it'll be fired and it'll make an excellent little ice cream mold. So some people might wonder why I only put one coat of glaze on this particular piece, and that was because the glaze was just the right thickness that when I dipped it once, it gave a nice even coating all over the whole glaze, and I really like when the Tinmaku glaze turns out with that rusty brown black combination. If I wanted it to be solid black with this particular glaze, I could dunk it a second time and that would make it darker. However, you want to make sure that you never put more than 3 layers of glaze. That's not, you know, a hard set in stone number. That's just a rule that I generally use with the glazes in our studio, because sometimes if you put too much glaze on a pot, it will actually run fairly heavily, and this person got very lucky. You can see this strip in particular went all the way down and almost touched the kiln shelf, but didn't. However, some students haven't gotten so lucky, and their pottery becomes a permanent installation of art on the shelves out in the kiln, and they don't get to take it home. And it's very, very frustrating. And then they also get to spend a lot of time grinding the shelves for me, which isn't super fun. So just make sure you're not putting glaze on too thick. The other thing you need to make sure of in terms of caring for your glaze before it gets to the kiln is once it turns into this dry, powdery chalk on the outside, be very careful not to bang it against any hard edges or hit it with your fingernail, because you can actually flake pieces of glaze off, and then you won't have any glaze there and it won't look as nice. Also, let's pretend you have 2 pots, one with a glaze that's very red and another glaze that is very white. Make sure you wash your hands before you touch the piece of pottery that isn't the darker colored glaze, because it will transfer just like chalk and powder to your clothes. It'll transfer to the other pieces of pottery.
Alright guys, so there's a couple of important things to note about glazes. So one of the most interesting things about glazes to me is how they're never really the color that you see in the bottle. So sometimes when we open up a glaze and we say, hey, I want to paint this cup red. So immediately we'll look towards our glazes and we'll say, okay, that one's red. I'm going to use that one to paint it red. But in reality, once you put it in the kiln and you fire it, it turns out it's blue. So we really have to be careful when picking and choosing our glazes, and if we need some help, you should always ask JC or myself so we can help you pick the correct glaze for your piece so that you're not disappointed when it comes out and it's not the color that you imagined. Another thing that I love about glazes is that there's so many different glazes. If you're going for something matte or without shine, we have matte glazes. We have gloss glazes, which give it that nice glossy finish. And we have some that are my absolute favorite, and they're crystal glazes that have actual little bits and pieces that explode in the kiln. So there's one that I particularly like. It's called Fruity Freckles, and it's so, so cute. It's has little speckles of orange and teal. So yeah, that's really important to note, again, that when you're selecting your glaze, you have to have something in mind, and it's not going to look like what you see there, but it's okay. We work together and we select the goal that the glaze that you envision, and then and we'll apply it to your ceramic piece. Also, talking about applying it, you can only apply your glaze to bisqueware. That means something that's already been fired. You can't go from greenware, something that hasn't been fired, and just apply glaze to it. It won't work that way. So you have to go through the steps in order to get your final product, your glazed product. Another thing that's important, like I mentioned in the other video, is that you have to load the kiln with stilts the second time around. So once it's bisqueware and you've added your glaze to it, you have to make sure to either leave a lip on the bottom so that your glaze doesn't bleed directly on to the kiln bed, or make sure to put it on a stilt to avoid it getting stuck to the kiln and making a big mess. So glazes are really tricky, but they're super fun. All right, so now that you guys know a little bit more about the ceramics process, I'm gonna go ahead and do a little show and tell. I'm gonna show you some of the tools that we use daily when we're working with ceramics, and I'm gonna show you the different stages of our clay that you guys have worked on. I brought some from WOW to go ahead and show you so you get a better idea. All right, so we're gonna start off with our first tool. This right here is called a scraper or a rib. This is used to smooth things out. So for example, if you're making a mug or a little pot and you see something's not even or has a lump in it, you can go ahead and use the scraper or the rib to smooth it out. So scraper or rib. Okay. Next, we're gonna go on to our needle. So the needle has two different sides to it. With this one, you can use it to scrape things. And on this side, we use this one mostly to make the holes in our ceramic flowers. So remember, whenever we're assembling our ceramic flowers, we have to put a stem in the middle. So we usually poke it with this in the middle to be able to put our stem through. We also use this one when we're making our Christmas ornaments, so that we're able to put a ribbon through it. Okay, so this is your needle. Okay, our next one is going to be our ribbon and loop tool. So this one, if you see it, it has like a little loop at the end. This one's used to scrape things out, or if you want to carve something out. So if you want to do like a design on your pot or whatever it is that you're making, you can go ahead and scrape it out easily with this. Or you can level something out. For example, if you're making a mug and the top is not completely even, you can go ahead and pass the loop around the top to scrape off whatever piece you want to take out. So ribbon and loop. All right, and then we're gonna go on to our paintbrushes. So we usually use these when we're glazing. So depending on what you want to glaze, you can use a thicker one for a bigger piece or a thinner brush if you want to do some detailed work. I forgot to mention in our glaze section, but whenever we're glazing in class, make sure that you're using 3 coats of glaze, and you have to wait for it to dry in between. So you're gonna do your first coat. You're going to let it dry, and you'll notice when it's dry, it's going to be a different color. So when you first apply it, you're going to see it's really wet, and then as it starts drying, it kind of looks chalky. So then you know you're ready for your second coat, and then you wait again for it to dry, and then you go on to your third coat. Remember when we're making our flowers, not to fill in the hole in the middle with glaze, because once that goes into the kiln, it'll melt, and there goes your circle, and you won't be able to put a stem in. So make sure you go ahead and glaze around it, and if you happen to get glaze in, it's okay. You can always add water to remove the glaze from the middle. Okay, so your paintbrush is for your glaze. Now I'm going to show you guys some of the flowers that you guys have made in class. I'm going to start off by showing you your greenware. Okay, so this is a flower that one of you made, and as you can see, this is still like a darker gray. I'm not sure if you can see it too well here, but this is a darker gray. And the reason it's considered greenware is because it hasn't been fired. Remember in one of the videos, she mentioned that greenware can break easily. So, see? Easily broken. That's greenware. All right, once it's already gone into the kiln, you're going to get something that looks like this. And this is bisqueware. Okay, so bisqueware is different because it's whiter in color. So it's not that dark gray that you see there, and it's not easily broken. So this is already hard and it's set and you can't change it. Okay, and our third step, I'm going to show you this ceramic flower. Okay, and this is the glaze that I was telling you guys about. This is the one that's called Fruity Freckles. So it has your little bits of orange, teal, blue, yellow, has a little bit of everything. So these are your crystal glazes, which are my favorite. I have another one called Poppy Fields. So this one has a little bit of pink, a little bit of orange, and a little bit of navy blue. That's another crystal glaze. All right, and then you also have your solids. All of these are gloss glazes, so they're all shiny. You have your reds, your sky blues, and your pinks. Okay, so now you know, next time you go into our class, those are all the steps that we take to get those beautiful ceramic bouquets going. I'm going to use the next few slides to incorporate some pictures of you guys working in class so you can see all of your hard work and how you guys went through all of the steps and the different processes and used all the different tools and the glazes to achieve the beautiful ceramic bouquets that you guys made for Valentine's Day. So go ahead and enjoy the pictures that I'm putting up. Now that we're familiar with the ceramics process and terminology, let's use our imagination, creativity, and knowledge to create a vision for the next ceramic piece that you want to complete in class. Take the next 30 minutes to draw what you would like to make or select and complete an activity of your choice from the options provided. Envision and create. Use your imagination and creativity to sketch the next piece you would like to create in class. Remember to be specific when you're designing it. So let us know if it's going to be a cup, a vase, what color it's going to be. Do you want it to be big or small? Okay, the materials for this assignment are paper, pencil, and either color pencils, markers, or crayons, whatever you have on hand at home. For your second option, you have a ceramics word search. So try and find some of the words that we discussed today, and as you find them, take a minute to remember what each term means. For your third and last option, you can watch a suggested video so you can expand your knowledge and learn more about the ceramics process by clicking on the link on the slide. I'm going to also provide that link in your resources pages. All right, guys, as always, thank you for tuning in. Remember to have fun and get creative. If you can, send us some pictures, some videos. We love to see what you're up to. You can tag us on social media. All right, so we'll see you next time. And as always, we wish you well.